We're going to get started on our grand challenge number 3, which is effective cyber and energy security. I have to say, we try to have half-hour calls with all the session panelists and their moderators before the event, and I get to listen to those calls, and it's just fascinating when you get these guys up here and talking about what they want to talk about and how they're sharing stories, and it's I think this one will be very fascinating because it's very timely. So we'll get started. Let me introduce Alan Rudolph, who is the Vice President of Research here at Colorado State University. I've had the pleasure of working with him. Right, Alan? It's been good, right? Yes, he has a thumbs up. And really enjoy talking with Alan. I have to say, Alan, when there is a subject, you always know something about it. But he doesn't act like he's a smart one in the room. He always is the smart one in the room. So we're expecting the smartness to come out and ooze out during this session. Okay, Mark? Or Alan, whatever your name is. My name is Sally. So please welcome this panel and Alan Rudolph.
Thank you, Maureen. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and the panel and I did have some great conversations. Of course, these are all over secure lines, but we had some great conversations. We hope to extend that and make this a conversation that you can both enjoy and participate in. You know, the topic, I think, is one that touches all of us in the last year in so many different ways in terms of cyber. And, you know, we've seen troves of personal information released recently, the Office of Personnel Management, NSA. There appears to be no corner of information that is untouched by the cyber. I think it's fair to say it's left us all in sort of an Equifax state of mind. You know, for energy utilities, these challenges really present a lot of complexities, and we've got a great panel to talk about that. You know, we've seen actual incidences and attacks on the energy utility systems, Dragonfly 2.0, that, you know, routinely sort of testing what we know and how well we're prepared, and yet we know that we're significantly unprepared and really emerging into an era that we don't have a lot of experience with. We continue to be surprised by new ways to intercede with data integrity. Even odd things. Recently, you may have seen the University of Washington, DNA can store messages, the message of life can store messages, and there was a paper that showed you could use DNA as malware and take over the operating system of a sequencer. And so we're continually challenged with sort of new ways to go at some of these problems. That obviously implications for the patency and curation of information around things like biomass conversion. We've had plenty of reports about how unprepared we are, and there's organizations like NIAC that routinely sort of looks at gaps. We run kinds of test beds and field experiments that we've done routinely to sort of look at these areas and see where our vulnerabilities are. We've had some great thought pieces. Richard Danzig, former Secretary of the Navy, who's been a thought leader in cyber, describes this situation, which I think is true for energy as well, as surviving on a diet of poisoned fruit. And I think that's really sort of a good analogy because of the complexities we face. And I think we're going to spend some time on this panel talking about, is security really the right approach? Is it really more resilience and accepting insecurity as a way to approach this problem? So we've got a great panel. We're going to talk about some concepts like resilience. We're going to look at some of the issues with workforce and generational development, what it means for organizational structures in some of the big companies, because we're entering really a new era of how do we even populate industry or government with the right people in the right place to make a difference in the cyber area around energy. We've got representatives from industry, from academia, and government, so we've got the three stools, three legs of the stool here this afternoon, which I think is also a great way to bring out the perspectives of the different sectors and talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities. And we'll touch upon, some of the aspects of not only the roles these three sectors play, industry, academia, and government, but also some of the preparations and activities going on in those sectors that prepare us. And finally, I think when we talk about data, we'll obviously have to bring in issues around standards and interoperability as we look at preparing ourselves better for resilience in cyber systems around energy. There's clearly a complexity with all the privatization of the energy sector of how do we bring this data together in a rational way, create some standards, and make it interoperable as we think about cyber protection of our energy systems. So what I've asked each panel member to do is give a brief introduction of their perspective on this broader area, and then we're going to return to those three areas of resilience, workforce development, and some analytics to probe a little bit further. And then I want you to be thinking about your questions that you'd like to ask us, and we'll stop and look out over the audience on occasion to see what's on your mind. And I think there's an email you can also, or a text, you can also send your questions to Maury as well. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll turn to my left, Andrew Bachman from the Idaho National Labs. Andy, you've got a lot of experience in this space, sort of advising a large national lab that's dealing with a lot of the issues in cyber grid security. Let's hear a little of your perspective on this broad area, and then we'll go down the line.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. My name's Andy. Please don't be distracted by my socks. I dressed in the dark this morning in Boston and got here. So, as Steve said, eyes up here. My Colorado bona fides are I went to a small military school in Colorado Springs. I played hockey there. And then every other year, almost every other year since then, I go hiking up in Maroon Bells, Aspen, Snowmass area and have a wonderful time. So my connections to the state still feel strong. Thanks for the nice introduction. And without further ado, let's just go into the deck. Does some person out there turn things, or do I? The next one, yeah, the next one, thanks. Okay, so we said we were going to talk about people issues as opposed to drilling down into deep technological issues, which we might do a little bit if that's interesting to you and accessible, but let's do a couple of the people things first. And governance in this case means not the government overwatch function looking at all the utilities and energy companies and suppliers, but this is from the perspective of inside an electric utility, and you could stretch that out to energy or industrial company too, and then workforce issues related to that. Why does this even matter right now? I have to put this as a stake in the ground because things that used to be largely mechanical and analog in nature have become utterly digitized, and the trend is massively, it's that way now, and the trend is even more so in that direction. Folks like Steve to my left have to deal with the ramifications of that fact every day as they plan out their infrastructure and try to imagine ways of protecting it in some means. So everything is connected, right? It's not just connected, but everything has memory and a processor and communications and logic and tons of software. Back to Danzig's surviving on a diet of poisoned fruit. That's his main target. So I'm going to talk both high and low here in terms of positions. On the left-hand side, talking about true energy company chief security officer. I'll just say true CSO. The reason I'm emphasizing true is that almost every company, and probably a lot that you know, have somebody called the CISO, the CISO, or Chief Information Security Officer. They're usually somewhere in the IT stack below the CIO, and their ability to affect change across the whole company, especially in an industrial company, we have operations and machines that make, manage, and move large amounts of electricity. I don't really want to listen to somebody in IT for that long. So it puts them in not a great position to do their job, actually, you know. So the true the true CSO, and I get rid of the I because it sort of points you back to the IT operation, reports to someone who's not the CIO. And you could say it should be the CEO, Chief Operating Officer, maybe the General Counsel if it's more compliance-oriented, or the CFO, but get them out of the IT stack. I'm going to talk a little bit more about their characteristics, but I'll usually say, ideally, this person has dominion over IT and OT, OT being operational technology, the machines again, and the cyber systems that support them, and cyber and physical security. The trends here are that there are some examples, including Steve to my left is occupying a position like I'm describing, but it's a slow rolling process. We're a conservative industry. We don't do anything too fast, especially in security. That's probably doubly true. On the right-hand side, I'm talking about more like doers instead of the management level, now people that are hands-on equipment, hands-on systems. And so in this case, we're talking about engineers and operators, but engineers and operators who understand the cyber aspects of the systems that are starting to be deployed in their domain. If you're on the distribution side, the smart grid side, heck, all of that stuff by definition is automated to some degree. But if you're back in centralized large generation plants and the hub and spoke system of our legacy grid, now you're talking about men and women who've really never had to really significantly deal with too much computerization, too much automation. They use interfaces called HMIs, but they haven't had to become fluent in cyber, haven't even touched it in some cases. So we're trying to work with universities, other government organizations, other companies, including training companies, to create basically a wave of people who are both cognizant of cybersecurity issues of the systems that they're working with and the ways they could be exploited, how they might start acting funny, and still to get their job done. As I said, the trends are not promising here, as we as a species seem to be moving headlong into making it more of a challenge, not less of a challenge. Internet of Things, autonomy, automation, AI, et cetera, neural implants and things like that. So not great from a security point of view, but Steve's going to take care of it. Okay, this is just showing you really quickly. This is sort of the way things have been in the past. The yellow boxes are where on the left-hand side, the head of cyber is, and on the right-hand side, it's a different person for physical. You can see that they're underneath one or two layers down from people that really have broad decision-making authority. And that sweeping yellow sort of windshield wiper thing, that's basically, I'm positing, that's what the CEO can see and the board can see. They can't go too far down the org chart. They can't know everybody. And that used to be okay. It's not okay now. And so this is what we're proposing, is that increasingly the CISO position moves up and plugs directly into somebody in the true C-suite. And in fact, often may plug directly into the CEO, which is happening in some places. And that gives them great visibility. Okay, and then question, what kind of person do you want, what kind of person could do this job? What would be the right skill sets? It certainly can't be just a complete tech weenie, somebody that just came up out of admin. It has to be somebody that's really comfortable in speaking in dollars and cents with the true C-suite and the board of directors, translating risk into dollars and vice versa. So, but they've got to know their sector. They've got to know security to a certain extent. And does this person exist? And if they don't exist, are they a unicorn? Maybe they're Frankenstein, and you can patch them together using other people. It's almost Halloween, right? It's good. It's good stuff. I'm going to go past this because I think I'm aware I'm moving into my colleagues' time too much, but I have one slide here and then an outro, which is what is the Idaho National Lab doing? We've created this entity called the CyberCore Integration Center with other national labs and with universities, particularly regional universities. And it starts at the STEM level in junior high and high schools, touches community colleges and universities, starts to expose people that have sort of a hacker personality for machines and computers. So it's not just the IT type folks that you see, but people that like to do maker type stuff and get them touching these things already and getting them involved. In terms of training, you see a plug here for the Department of Homeland Security's Red Team, Blue Team training. Again, that's operational technology, hands-on security training. That's in Idaho. If you haven't been to Idaho yet, it's just completely lovely, way better. It's not better than Colorado, but it's not too far away. And it is a mountainy state, right? The Mountain West. And then lastly, and that training is free, by the way. And then lastly, you may, depending on what you pay attention to, be aware that the grid in Ukraine has been under assault a number of times in the last couple of years. People are calling it a training ground for cyber attackers, Russian cyber attackers in particular. We're using it also as a classroom. So colleagues of mine are helping in Ukraine, giving them training, advice, and doing forensics. At the same time, we're also learning and taking those learnings back here to train our operators, our security people. So travel roadshow called Ukraine in a Box that's been in different places. I think it went to Broomfield not too long ago, Colorado, and it'll come around again. My last slide says, Amory and I go back some time. If you stay here till 6 o'clock, he's the keynote. You can see here, this is a blog I used to run called the DoD Energy Blog, and we did multi-part interviews. He's very, you might think of him, some people, if they don't know him, think he's, just a granola tree hugging renewable energy and efficiency guy, right? He's not like that. He's not like that. He's just a total crazy engineer. But this is the way he wants to re-engineer the world, and aligns very much, at least with my thinking, and probably a number, maybe almost everybody in this room. He's helped DoD a lot become more efficient, become a better warfighting machine by thinking about energy in ways they never did before. So I'm excited to see him. I hope you are too, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew, especially since I'm a bio guy throwing in the neural implants. I really appreciate that part. So Steve, you are our card-carrying, operating cyber guy inside of industry, and what's interesting about what Andrew said is certainly talking about the organizational structure is important. Love to hear your comments on that, but as we know, we're seeking a behavioral change inside the organizations as we look at the actual structure of that organization. So I'd love to hear you sort of chat about that, as someone who Andrew described who actually exists inside and working in this area. What kinds of trends do you see in the workforce development needed to better prepare for cyber threats?
First of all, I appreciate it, Andy, you described me, but you're missing one thing. We don't get paid enough. So if you want to update your slide, I'll share it with my CEO right away. I'm Steve Brown. I am the Chief Security Officer of XL Energy. I have physical, cyber, and enterprise resiliency groups. Previous to coming aboard, I came on board 18 months ago. I still consider myself an energy virgin. I think you have to have 20 years before you're actually allowed to say you've been around in energy. First thing they did was they created a CISO slot and put me at the Chief Operating Officer, or the head of utilities, the Executive Vice President of Utilities. So it did match that. And then they placed the physical as well as the resiliency aspects under me as well. We're seeing a trend where it's not there yet, but we're seeing a convergence of physical as well as cyber threats, and we can leverage that. One of the things I did notice is when I decided to come to the energy sector, my previous background was in financial sector, where it's a lot more mature as far as funding, the way they throw money at it. It's what hits the news. But I came at the right time. I'm actually seeing in the sector, energy sector, kind of a wave where they're going away from the traditional defenses where you can't have any type of breach. It's all has to be isolated. We only have systems in our operating technology environment that are mechanical or analog. Since I've come on board, I've seen the wave. IT and OT are converging very closely, very quickly. What that means to us is suddenly we're getting digital systems into these systems that were built for 50 years that weren't designed to do digital work. They were designed to fail over automatically. We're seeing a change in the mentality. Traditionally, the OT engineers, extremely talented at what they do, but their way to monitor is pretty much an alarm goes off and said, we've got a failure, turn this off. It doesn't work that way in the IT cyber world. More often than not, we actually do not see indicators. They're very subtle, or they're false positives. That's the difference between IT and cyber. IT tends to rely more on the alarms, the screens going red. We're focused on digging deep, and that's where our main threat is stuff that you don't see on the screen. You have to be able to pull it up. So we're trying to integrate the two worlds, trying to get people to understand you can't protect the network 100%. There is no such thing as a hack-proof network. If there were, I'd try to work there because I could sleep a lot better at night. Every network is going to get penetrated somehow. What's different is how far they get into your network and are they able to get out of your network with the information. Everyone always says that the defenders have, hacker only has to be right one time. The defenders have to be right every time. That's not true. The truth is when the attacker gets in, they have to, A, find a way to get in. That's my first opportunity to detect. Second, they have to find what they're looking for, do reconnaissance. That's my second opportunity. Then they have to be able to compromise the system or do reconnaissance and compromise others. I now have a third opportunity. If they're there to steal data, they have to get it out of my network. So that's my fourth opportunity. So we do have multiple opportunities. So we do focus on the resilience aspect, the multiple layers of defense to detect them initially, block wherever possible, block 85 to 90% of all attacks. But then we can focus the high-level technology, the multiple layers, to identify the more subtle attacks that we see. And we also have to push this into the OT environment, again, where it's not traditional, where we don't have systems that are designed to provide me the data we're looking at. So that's our challenge, and getting the right people and getting the mindset is growing, but I think we're doing a pretty good job.
Thanks, Steve. A quick question before we move on to Don. Andrew talked about red team, blue teaming. Can you talk a little bit about how that plays a role in sort of your day-to-day operations?
Yeah, one, we have an annual third-party penetration test, or red team, if you will. That's always done by an outsider. We always switch vendors or whomever. We try to take care of the government programs wherever possible because it's free. But we also spend a lot of money on some of the more sophisticated, well, I shouldn't say more sophisticated, but an external third-party vendor that'll come in and do it. We focus on different areas each time. From a blue team perspective, we're constantly running these scenarios, these threats. This happens every day. Red team, it's very specialized. They come in. We don't tell anybody because we want to test our own people. My cyber defense center, I want to see if they actually detect this stuff. How quickly do they detect it with their actions? But the blue team stuff is constantly running all the time. We're testing our network every day. We're testing aspects of it. But we also have what we call white teaming. Now, white teaming is when we want to go out and touch an area of the network, such as the OT environment, that's extremely sensitive, that we don't want to make a mistake and inadvertently cause our own denial of service, take the system down. So what we do with that is we put our people side by side with the actual operators and begin to run the test, and they watch. And if we're touching something that could have a bad effect, we back off. But we learn from it, because generally you don't red team some of those environments.
Thanks. Our third panelist, Donald Paul from University of Southern California. You can also speak, based on your long career in Chevron, about the industry, but now you're in academia, so you can also shed a little light on the academic role in this interesting moving area.
Well, thank you. Thank you, and it's really an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. I'll touch on a couple of things, but I think the key aspect at large when you're thinking about the energy infrastructure is that this is a cyber-physical problem. And in fact, the real threats are not the loss of information per se, like you're concerned about with the Equifax hack and any of the number of others. It's really the loss of control of operations. And it may manifest itself many ways. Loss of visibility, to the point that you can't see what's going on in the operation, for example. But it's cyber attacks generating bad physical outcomes. And that could be loss of power in the grid, could be overpressuring a pipeline, if it's natural gas or oil. There's a whole raft of, and all of these have happened. Okay, so this isn't a theoretical issue. One of the root issues is that we have basically levels of automation and control built into these infrastructures that we've been doing for a long time, many decades, most of which were never built to be defended from a digital point of view. Now, modern ones have more of it, but as I would argue that our rate of digitization, the growth in digital intensity of the energy infrastructure is well outrunning many of our capabilities. And the industrial Internet of Things is one of the areas where we can see, at least from our point of view, we see the problem getting bigger, at least before the capability of organizations is getting bigger. And it's an exponentially growing challenge. And the other aspect, a couple other aspects I want to mention, and then I'll wrap up talking about Brad's comment, which I think is great, which is growing the right people for this to work in this energy environment. Another area that people don't think about, but energy infrastructures are critically dependent on very long, very complex, very large supply chains. We use hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers in the power system and the oil and gas system. In the modern world, supply chain efficiency only works when everybody gets connected. So every time you connect a supplier, you just internalize their security, whether you like it or not. And in fact, approximately 80% of all the major busts occur in suppliers, not the operators. The issues come through your supply chains. That's a real serious issue. The other aspect is, can we change the culture? Can we produce a security culture? And I really recall this from, we started at Chevron, I started the cybersecurity program right at Y2K, so it's quite a while ago. But bringing about a culture where people think about security the way industrial companies now think about safety, that was a cultural change. Okay, it used to be acceptable. Oh, no, it's a dangerous business. People get hurt. Wait a minute, no, they don't. They don't have to. Security is the same issue, but the problem is our digital dependence. And it goes all the way from you as an individual. If you want a bad day, leave your phone at home, and you'll have a bad day. To organizations have the same level of dependence. And this dependency creates behavioral problems that are also the other source of risk. I'll just wrap up my comments saying about how do you grow the next generation of engineers for the power sector and for the oil and gas sector. This is actually a primary focus of our programs at USC. And how do you bring about this fusion, which is really what you need? You also need, underneath this, what I would call the technical platform specialists in cybersecurity technology. That's an absolute requirement too. But ultimately, to run these systems in the real world, you need individuals that have content knowledge to go with it. And so I think we're starting to produce these kinds of individuals, but as you pointed out, it's a long evolution of maturity if you work in energy. I had exactly the same. When you've been here 20 years, you'll know what you're doing. I mean, that's the general attitude. And so, but there is something to the practical reality of running these infrastructures, and the fact that you're investing. And I'll kind of close with that. When you build power plants, you build pipelines, you build refineries, you do any of these capital investments, major capital investments, are designed to last decades. Information systems over the course of decades are completely transformed. So you've got a very high-speed cycle intersecting something that's generational in length. And that intersection and how you manage that creates fundamental problems in this cyber physical security problem.
You have a comment, Andrew?
I just wanted to say, when Dr. Paul mentioned how rapidly things are becoming digitized in our sector, our otherwise slow-moving, quaint, you've got to have a couple decades of experience sector. One of the primary lessons from Ukraine attacks, the one just before Christmas in 2015, and then another one in 2016, distribution the first time, transmission the second time. The thing on the first one that largely saved them, they didn't have, how can I say this? They didn't have a Puerto Rico style blackout. It's just a couple hours in both cases. And one of the takeaways from the first one on the distribution grid, 3 distribution utilities, was that they were largely saved by their lack of automation. They were just getting ready to deploy some advanced distribution management functionality. They were playing around with starting to deploy it, but all the other folks, sometimes we refer to this mythical person who used to work in the substation with his dog, Fred. Fred used to live in the substation or right next to it. And all you had to do is call him up on the landline and ask him to read something or turn a knob, and he would do it. There's no digital stuff involved. In Ukraine, they still had Fred around. And so when they couldn't trust their systems anymore because they're acting crazy, they were able to go into an almost entirely manual mode. The problem for us, and this is not a doom and gloom panel, you can tell. You'll know if it's a doom and gloom cyber panel. This isn't one. Right, the socks are a dead giveaway. That we are past that point in the United States. We've automated, and I'll leave to other panelists and Alan to corroborate this statement, but we're way past that. We're super automated. On a good day, we're great. We're so freaking efficient, it's unbelievable. But we're brittle, and if things start to get a little bit sideways, we don't have the option. Fred is not around anymore, so we have to approach this a different way.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that, it's not only automation, but I'd like to talk about AlphaGo Zero. And if you're familiar with AlphaGo Zero, it's the DeepMind Google announcement 2 weeks ago that a computer in 3 days without any human training learned the game Go and beat the world's best Go player 100 times straight. And so we're now entering sort of the war games Joshua era of, you know, sort of having not only automation, but analysis and learning, quote unquote, at least computational learning, going on and running, potentially running systems even more and more in the automation. So how do you prepare for that kind of future where you're losing even more control over the system?
Well, I think that there's several aspects to this. One is simply the amount of information you're collecting, which is growing exponentially because sensors have gotten cheap, and now in many energy infrastructures, you're integrating things you didn't think about integrating information. Well, you're integrating visual information that may come from drones, may come from all the new sensor systems. You're bringing all of this because if you're really going to be watching for very subtle but perhaps telltale effects in the system, you may need multidimensional data that indicates things are abnormal. But we're already at the point where individuals can't monitor all the data, and modern facilities generating terabytes of data. So you're going to have machines looking at the data. So you're going to need machines that learn to look at the data and do analysis. But what that does is the human is now moving from being in the loop in the traditional monitoring, either a power station, refinery, traditional monitoring. They have to introduce a new level of automation and machines between you and the data flow, so you're now kind of on the loop, but you're no longer in the loop. Take one more leap, you're not in it anymore, and now you have automated monitoring and facilities. People are building lights-out facilities now. So lights out means there are no humans. So I think the real question then is, you've increased your dependency on your digital dependency, but it may be the only way in which you can defend yourself. So there's a conundrum in that.
So I agree with all those points, but there is a balance. We have to digitize. It's just what the customer wants. That's where they're going. They want the convenience. It's going to happen. So what we have to do is we do handle this huge amount of data on a daily basis. On a slow month, my Cyber Defense Center will process about 19,000 events per second. Now, there's no way my analysts can look at it. The idea about security, most people think security means 100% closed. It doesn't. 85% of those events are really non-events. So there's a game you probably have all played we call whack-a-mole. That's the worst form of security, but that's what many people do. What you do, think of a whack-a-mole board with 9 holes in it. Multiply that by about 9,000, and you've got the grid. So the first thing we want to do is put controls that eliminate about 4,000 of those right away. Can't get in, digital diodes, firewalls, whatever you, but the idea is to restrict it. So now my problem's almost halved. Not quite, but almost. Then we want to take different types of sensors and put them throughout the network. All this data that's flowing are places that I can stick vampire taps in and suck the data in to look at it. And we look at anomalies. So by using threat intelligence, having an actual threat intelligence team that specializes in this, myself, I'm a former signals intelligence officer. A lot of my team are that. We're looking at what we call TTPs, techniques, tactics, and practices. TTPs are, this is the modus operandi of the attacker. This is how they do it. This is how this works. But we're also scanning our networks constantly so we know our own vulnerabilities, so we know what to be sensitive. But by having this intelligence in place, we can begin to be a little more proactive, identify areas we feel that they're going to try and focus on the attacker, and we've closed up a few more holes. And then we bring in a team called a hunt team. These are specialists. They go in the hole to find the mole. And they begin looking for them. And they're taking all this data that's in that network and we're comparing it. We're using data lakes, high-speed analysis. So it is a challenge, but it's a balancing act. And again, if we can eliminate 95 of those percent of the threats in these manners, we can then focus the remaining resources on the true threats to us.
I will try to always remember the whack-a-mole metaphor now. It's very visual. This is what I'm going to say now is probably more in line than what I think I can tell is going on in Dr. Paul's head sometimes, and that is we're going to automate. We're going to embrace technology, deploy it for financial reasons, partly just because it's what we do as a tribe. We need it, actually, if we're going to really have substantial amounts of DER, distributed energy resources, if we're going to do demand management, if we're going to have storage. So it's just if you want that, you've got to have the burden of the extra complexity in technology. However, one of the things the Idaho National Lab is working on, and it comes from its heritage as a real applied engineering lab, not a Star Trek or a Harry Potter lab, but applied engineering, is that we've developed a methodology. It's too complicated to even say its name, so I won't say that. But it works like this. It's like and we just did a pilot with a very large utility. We asked the CEO and his or her principal executive staff, what are the things, you have a gigantic multi-state operation with millions of endpoints, you have generation and transmission. Out of all of that, what are the handful of things, what are the handful of functions that simply must not ever fail? It's intolerable. In business language, this is strategic business risk or corporate viability. If you were to lose these functions for more than a day or two, you'd be done. You'd have nothing to worry about because your company doesn't exist. That really helps focus their mind. It doesn't happen instantly, too. It takes a few days to get at those things and make your cutoff point. But once we do that, then we walk them through taking a look called system of system breakdown. What are all the computers and comms that support those things that must not fail? Then we go to a third part. The term of art in cybersecurity world is called cyber kill chain. It basically just means finding the easiest way through that map of all the systems that an adversary would use, because they don't get extra credit for taking the long way. What are the easiest ways that they can go in through that map that you've drawn out to achieve the effect they're trying to achieve? And that's the thing. Steve's touched on it too. It's not just a one-time thing you hack and now you've created the effect. To create a kinetic effect on these complicated systems, these old systems too, takes a hell of a lot of study, practice, patience, and knowledge. But once you've mapped that out, you can show that to the CEO and say, check this out. These things that you absolutely depend on, these handful of things, this is how adversary would take them out with relative ease. And so at that point, this is where I'll trail off, is where instead of throwing more complicated security technology at it, we use engineering solutions largely, re-engineering the process, sometimes in ways that make it less efficient. Sometimes taking Fred and finding Fred's in-laws, offspring, and putting them back in the loop, getting them involved, trusted people back in the loop. It's not going to stop the smart grid. 99% of this will proceed apace in terms of more technology. But then we have to keep saying, for the handful of things that simply must not fail, it might be time to look at them and with a different approach that is somewhat retro in its inspiration.
Jump in, Don.
Yeah, I think a couple things. For the first time in a long time, I've been to conferences where people are talking about 21st century analog for critical functions. Well, it has some things going for it in these really critical points. But the other issue, which is that we haven't talked about, is that your biggest source of risk, especially if you include your suppliers, are all insiders. I mean, the compromising your employees is by far the most powerful thing to do. And certainly in state-sponsored cyber attacks, this is a primary venue, but I think increasingly organized crime, which of course has a proven business model of compromising people and knows how to do it. So one of the other issues, I'd be interested in my co-panelist's view, is we're starting to work with companies on this, is how do you do behavioral analytics on all of your employees? How do you begin to identify unusual communication patterns, other kinds of things? And this is a sensitive area. But there's no question that in the modern digitized company, you can monitor every keystroke, every phone call, every time they come out of their office into the hallways because you got cameras everywhere. How do you go down that road? Because in a way that if you can't solve the insider problem, then you're vulnerable.
Steve, I see the glimmer in your eye.
I think there's some Excel folks out in the audience, so if you'll close your ears for a moment. I spent 20 years in the Navy in a little group that worked for a 3-letter agency, and our motto was simple. In God we trust, everyone else we monitor. The difference between an insider threat and an external threat, whether it's a cyber criminal, nation state, is the insider threat starts inside. The external threat is not a threat until they get inside. The minute they go inside, the techniques are pretty the same. The only difference is more often than not, they have elevated privileges. But that's an attacker style. They're going to elevate their privileges. The first thing the attacker does when they compromise your machine is go for privilege escalation. So a lot of people separate the insider threat from the external threat. The way we have to monitor and approach it are identical. We consider everybody a threat. I know that's paranoid, but just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean you're not all out to get me. We don't, our vendors, and Don's excellent point, we see more and more threats at our vendors on a regular basis. We've instituted, and I highly recommend it, all companies do this, a simple vendor assessment program. Every vendor, without exception, that comes into Excel, we're talking thousands, 2 questions are asked. Well, actually, it's 4, but the 2 I'm most concerned with, are you going to touch my data? Are you going to maintain my data? And the one I'm really concerned, are you connecting to my network? If you're selling me pencils, I could care less. If you're connecting to my network, I want to know what your security program's like. I want to know how you're connecting to my network. And if you don't want to tell me, fine, we'll find another vendor.
I bet almost everybody here, depending on where you work, I don't know if you work in Steve's hellscape or not, but everybody gets phishing training now, right? Everybody is in the flow of emails that you get from whoever your boss is, unless you're solo. Certain things that look like they're urgent, right? And you need to do something, right? It's pretty important, and so you need to click on something. but you shouldn't, because it's a test to see if you're gullible and you'll go for it. I'm just riffing off of the insider threat comment. The minute, in a way for people who aren't cybersecurity world people to maybe better understand, the minute someone clicks on that thing, and someone will, because it's the law of numbers and averages, that person is no longer really hacking, and the attacker is no longer really hacking anymore. They now have credentials. That's a very important word. They're credentials. They are an authorized user of your system. They can travel free as your security policy and segmentation allow on your networks and use your systems and data. And so that's why everyone is so incensed about the phishing and spear phishing and the training and trying to get people that through their heads, don't click on it, even if you're tired, even if you're multitasking. Because once they're in, they're an authorized user, and they proceed as you would proceed if you're having a bad day.
And on the physical side, when somebody comes in and is going to service a system, in modern systems today, if it's a compressor, they have to plug into the system. They can't do the servicing. And so if they've been compromised, well, this is the target hack for the HVAC system. So smart attackers will have a strategy. It might take them a long time, months, maybe a year to execute it. And they're going to back up down your supply chain until they can find somebody they can get on the inside. And so you've got your castle and your moat, and it's well defended, but then you unlock the door to let the people bring food inside. And that's I think, is one of the, so we come back to the same thing. It comes back to the people, both the skills and the culture.
So we will entertain your comments and questions on this topic. And I see a hand up in the back, so I think a microphone will make its way to you. And no, we can't freeze your credit system, so don't ask us about that.
All right, thank you. Most of what we heard was mostly about cybersecurity, a little bit about the physical side, and I just wanted to posit, if anyone is actually talking about maybe not threats from hostile people, but just threats from natural disasters. I've heard it come up multiple times with, getting hit by a massive, a solar flare, and maybe would that cause a Puerto Rico-style blackout in the U.S., and is anyone talking about that, even if the chance is so remote?
So yeah, we didn't bring that up, but there's quite a bit of work on electromagnetic pulse or other types of interruptions to the system. I thought you were going to start to ask us about extreme weather events and some of those recent events, because I'd be interested to ask the panel in the rebuilding of some of these systems, whether on islands or in major cities, what would you do in building those systems differently in terms of the context of what we've been talking about, is building them for resilience.
I'll do a quick hit on EMP and GMD, that's electromagnetic pulse, and geomagnetic disturbance. We always get a question on that, cyber people do. And it's reasonable to bring it up, so I didn't mean that as a diss. All I'll say is there are several, always almost ongoing DOE, sometimes DHS programs. We have a lot of modeling for the effects of those events, but again, it seems like I'm overly plugging my employer, but Idaho National Lab has a giant test grid, and it's a place where some of those agencies and academic institutions go, and it's a way to validate the models, right? If you're using a model on supercomputers, but it's wrong, then you can't have a lot of confidence. So the experiments are going on now to better understand the effects of solar storms and electromagnetic pulse. You could say North Korea. And to develop mitigations.
I can say that we do look at all those things. On the fiscal security side, which rolls up to me, I can tell you that the monitoring that's done is just absolutely amazing. So my cyber threat intelligence team is complemented by a physical threat intelligence team. So we're getting from government sources. We're very tight with the local police, law enforcement, as well as the FBI and others to look at this and be very proactive. We're trying to use, not just look at using drones for maintenance A lot of our stuff's out in the middle of nowhere for miles. But also, how do we use drones from a security perspective? How do we introduce different technologies, or we can monitor these isolated substations? As far as the things like the solar events, I'm not smart enough to speak to it. I just know that in the emails I see, there was a great conversation about one of the upcoming events, and I'm just glad I don't have to do that for a living. I got the easy job.
Have another question up here front.
From the internet. Is this one? Yeah. Okay. It's, can the panelists provide an example or a hypothetical of how a cybersecurity attack could affect a physical energy system, and what are the motives behind actors who commit these kinds of attacks?
I'll give one. I mean, some of the most, an easy one to understand is our gas pipelines. In fact, they've been a source of attack for several reasons. Number one, you have a pressurized flammable material. So the way an attack would occur is that along these pipelines, you have control systems which open or close valves for the gas flowing down a pipeline. You get into those control systems, you send, now all the information from those control systems goes back to some central monitoring station. Even it has been that way for a long time. So if you corrupt that control system, you send green lights back to control, you shut the valve, you overpressure the pipeline, it explodes, and you have a giant event. And this has happened. So one of the things is you get a hold of a control system with the design of creating a really bad, abnormal condition, but the information that's being sent back to the monitoring, through the monitoring system, is everything's okay. So that's sort of a classical corruption.
About 2 years ago, they, I think it was now, it's not energy, but water supply. Ransomware is becoming much more pervasive, and it's targeting systems. So by targeting your water supply and some of the programmable logic controls that are on some of the analog or mechanical devices, if you get ransomware on it, then you can just say, look, I'm going to open up the valve that releases chlorine into your community's water supply if you don't pay. So that's one example. On the private side, if you have a smart thermostat, you can't hit it from the grid side, our side of the house, but you just have to, if I hack your phone, I can actually turn your thermostat up or down. And if you're in Minnesota in the middle of winter and I drop it down and then call you up and say, hey, I'll turn it back on, you're probably going to pay.
And you've heard me mention Ukraine a couple times. I'll address the how part of it, and the why part I'll allow you to fill in for yourself. The how part on the 2015 event was there was a lot of preliminary work, a lot of preliminary surveillance, understanding the way the systems work. There were 4 distribution utilities that were targeted. 3 actually were compromised significantly. And ultimately, the attackers took control of the operator's workstation, human-machine interface, it's called HMI. And as the attack was happening, one of the things they noticed was the cursor, so not the mouse, but the cursor on the screen, was moving around on the operator's console, and it was opening relays. It was basically causing the blackout. And the operator still had a mouse and a cursor control too. So there were a few minutes, and they filmed this like on an old cell phone. It was like a duel, like in the West, where the cursor would go and open up a breaker, and then the operator would fight with his mouse and attempt to wrestle the cursor back and close the breaker again. And so this was going back and forth, and ultimately the adversary is just like, screw that, I can cut you off, and they did. So they opened up the breakers that way, and kept them open for a while.
I mean, maybe the most famous was the Stuxnet virus, which was the attack of the industrial control systems for the Iranian centrifuges. And actually, that event changed the entire trajectory of industrial control system attacks, because it said here is a whole new playing field in the critical part of the infrastructure, physical infrastructure, completely undefended. It was never designed to be defended. and we've been scrambling ever since to catch up with respect to these systems.
Brian.
From CSU Energy Institute. And first, I want to start by saying that you guys are just a bundle of sunshine on a Monday afternoon.
Is it the socks?
You know, Alan's a biosecurity guy, and there are those who would argue that the largest threat we have to the power grids are biological from squirrels and animals. Yeah. And I just wanted to, because that's a common, I don't know if it's a myth or perception, but you know, and also where do events like that fit into the overall security strategy?
Events like squirrels?
Yeah, squirrels and birds.
Squirrel events. Other rodents. I'll broaden the question.
Rat chewing the lines.
Squirrels really are the #1 threat. The truth is they're everywhere, and they like to get on power lines for some reason. So it's more of a resiliency issue, which is common. I mean, whether it's a weather event or secret squirrel jumping on it, it's something we practice. Unfortunately, every day, every time we have a weather event, we have our crews out. So squirrels are just part of that. I have yet to see a cyber squirrel, but if I do, it then becomes my issue.
Yep. And also, some of you may have read or seen on 60 Minutes a few years ago in Silicon Valley, there was a large substation there, and a guy or a couple guys shot out a lot of the coolant tanks on a bunch of transformers. And thanks to the miracle of the way we designed the grid, it didn't cause an outage, and it was at night too. And immediately that started the government thinking, we've got to prevent shooters from shooting these substations, even though some it would just be impossible. So some utilities, maybe Steve's, are building walls around certain key substations. And that's going to help with shooters, and it should help with certain squirrels, except for flying squirrels, because they don't have roofs.
Brian, thank you for bringing
drones.
back to the biological realm, because one of the conversations we had at the panel at the outset of this was the analogy, of course, to the biological immune system, right, where there's a tremendous amount of redundancy, and we all carry antibodies for things that we don't have symptoms to, but essentially run around our bloodstream looking for threats. So there's a lot of analogies, not only in biology, but I guess we'll have to think about cyber squirrels now as a new threat. Any last comments from our panelists as we summarize and close this session? I guess, you know, as Brian said, we could be a little sunnier in our exit in terms of optimism. We've used the word resilience. How optimistic, where are we in that sort of, are we leaning into the resilient realm, or are we just starting to really understand what that word means?
I'll take a shot at it. What I do for a living tends to be pessimistic. I mean, we're always being attacked. All I can tell you is I sleep really well at night. And it's not because of the fifth of vodka before I go to bed. It is simple fact. Since I've been in the sector, the resiliency aspect, it just blows me away. I really am impressed with the ability of the sector to overcome some of these hurricanes, storms, whatever, squirrels. The cyber, I'm seeing an uptick. Yeah, it is slow. We have challenges, but we have challenges in every sector. It's there. It's a part of life. And we're getting much, much better at anticipating and designing things for it. So I honestly do sleep well at night. It isn't a bad thing. If it was, I would have taken my white hat off long ago and put a black hat on.
Don, how are you sleeping?
I sleep fine, but I think it is important to realize that, and you see a lot of people out touting this, both to individuals as well as organizations, the cybersecurity problem is not actually soluble, but it is manageable. And I think that the key is to have organizations, and even in you as an individual, realize how to manage the risk down. You cannot, especially the critical risk, you can't eliminate them, but you can manage them. And I think that through that, you learn how to take on the risks you haven't seen yet.
Andy, last optimistic comment?
Sure. I just want to say thanks. This has been, for me anyway, compared to other grim-faced panels I've been on, this has been pretty good. And Alan is a wonderful moderator, and you guys are a really good audience too, so thanks.
Well,
it's been a
you
pleasure.
set the stage with those socks, so thank you. And thanks you to the audience. Thanks very much.